Hey everyone, Gabriel Nassif, aka Yellow Hat, and today for the second ep, I made it all the way to ep 2 of Daily MTG. 2 days in a row, let's go. I'm going to be talking about Blue-White Control in Standard, a deck I've played at the Pro Tour, a deck I've just played in the Regional Championship in Italy. I thought it was one of the best decks at the Pro Tour, still is, even though people have adapted. And I'm going to go over the list, talk a bit about some matchups, some sideboards, different ways you could build it. But before I guess I wanted to just kind of go back a bit in history and yeah, blue white control is basically a deck as old as time. It goes all the way back to the deck, which was a Brian Weissman blue white control deck back in 1996. So basically, as old as competitive Magic itself. So yeah, this is the original blue-white control deck, I guess. Had some power nine, some dual lands, cards like Sword to Plowshare, 4 Disenchant main deck, mana drain. So yeah, already back in the day, very few win conditions. What does this one have? Couple Sarah Angels to combo with your moat, and I think there's a yeah, you just had a combo of regrowth and recall, I believe. So you could kind of loop these cards once or twice, get back your win conditions, kind of run them out of cards. So yeah, that was the deck, and this is my first real competitive Magic deck. That's the deck I played, I think, in my first or second tournament. Not this exact list, but just Drago, Cuneo Blue, Mono Blue Control, whatever you want to call it, and people meme these days about not having win cons in control decks. This deck really had very few win cons. 4 Stalking Stones, which is kind of a creature land. It's a land you can pay 6 mana once to turn into a creature. And then 1 Rainbow Efrit, which was the creature was phasing, meaning once it's in play, it's pretty hard to kill if you have the mana to pay for the 2 blue to phase out. It could combo with your disc, and you see a lot of control, a lot of counter spells, some card draw, Whisper of the Muse, Dismiss, just pure control decks. And yeah, that was my first competitive deck. So control already back in the day, archetype dear to my heart. But yeah, back to today's blue light control deck. Enjoy it while it's still standard legal. There's big rotation coming up, and you're gonna lose, amongst others, Memory Deluge and the Wandering Emperor, which are 2 other reasons to play the deck. Deck's just really strong right now. Obviously, it's a 12 set standard, I think 12 or 14 sets, 12 sets. And every deck has access to pretty much everything they want. The big downside of blue white is its spot removal, whether it's in standard, pioneer, even you could argue modern, where you have to play triomes and bindings and prismatic ending. You just don't have good removal spells like you do have in black, like Fatal Push or Long Goodbye, even Shieldred's Edict. So that's always kind of been the downside of the white deck for a while now, the blue white decks. But besides that, you've got the great counter spells with No More Lies and 3 Steps Ahead. You've got Wandering Emperor, which is the reason to play the deck, or one of the reasons, just removal, win condition, deals with creatures, attacks planeswalkers, gives you that proactiveness that's kind of nice in some games. So yeah, this is not exactly the list I played in Naples. In Naples, I had only 2 Tidebinders in the main, and I had a Depopulate and a Jace as well in the main deck as a win condition. But I figured it might be cool to try Tidebinder. It also saves you sideboard slots. You do board out Depopulate in almost every matchup. And the only matchup where it's really good is Convoke. But Convoke gets the Invasion of Gobakan after sideboard, which it can counter a Depopulate once it's flipped. And Tidebinder is also just excellent in this matchup, so you're not losing out a ton, I feel. And the Jace is good in a lot of matchups where the Tidebinder is good. So yeah, makes the curve a tiny bit cheaper too, which was always nice. One of the problems this deck is kind of glutted on 4 was I feel like you kind of have to max out on these cards. Some people only play free Wandering Emperor, which is maybe acceptable, but yeah, I decided to just rebuild the deck like that. So Yeah, lots of little choices you can make. The numbers of marches and get lost, the numbers of sweepers. A lot of people don't play the farewell. I feel like that card's just super serviceable in almost every matchup, and I kind of have liking one in the main deck, especially if you're maybe playing on the ladder against some weird decks, or if your meta has some casual decks. I know my teammate Seth Manfield got paired against the Artifact deck at the Pro Tour, and Farewell won him the match. So if people are playing more fringe decks, maybe Farewell can shine there. And then the mana base is also up for debate, obviously. I don't mind 28 lands. I've been happy with 27. I've played 27 the whole time. I think you could maybe add a Myrex if you want to play 28. That would be a fine add, but I haven't found Myrex to be very, very useful. As for the sideboard, you also have a lot of options. Notably absent of this sideboard are Rest in Peace and Hearse. I only have the Flanker as a little bit of graveyard hate. But yeah, there's a bunch of options. Rest in Peace and Hearse are decent. You could play more negates. You could play more Get Lost. You can maybe add a sweeper to the sideboard. Some people like having a first Sunfall against a black-green midrange deck that's popular. You'll notice, speaking of black-green midrange, one Bailoff, which you cannot cast. Its sole purpose is there to counter the decks that go heavy on the discard. You've had some lists of black midrange deck play up to 3 or 4 Liliana and 3 or 4 Hostile Investigator. And that card can be really good in these spots. So I've quite liked it. You've got some anti-aggro cards like Extra Lockdowns and Valkyrie, Dust Animus. These two cards do a bit of the same thing. I'm not sure exactly which one's better. You've got the Horror for the slower matchups, really good in the Mirror and against Temur lands. And C Double, which is kind of became a pet card of mine. It was originally to counter Atraxa or get your own Atraxa for 4 mana. Kind of get around Cavern of Souls, maybe hit a Tidebinder and counter their Atraxa trigger, things like that. But it's also good if you know your opponent's going to have Hullbreaker Horror, which you can assume in the mirror match. You can also maybe bring it in against the Temur Lands deck. They're sometimes going to have Horror, sometimes going to have cards like Front or Bonnie-Pile, Roxane, so you can at least get their creatures. And I've kind of liked that card. One card I haven't tried yet, but that's been strong against me, and I feel like it would be really good in the mirror, is the Sphinx. The idea is in the mirror, you just flash it in when they tap out, and then they basically can't get rid of it. If you look at my configuration after sideboard, I'm boarding out all the sweepers. The Wandering Emperor doesn't really work against it, or not very well. It's kind of tricky. Removal doesn't work. So if you don't have sweepers and they're careful, that card can be really hard to deal with, and it kills really fast as well. I guess it might make it a little awkward. It might be awkward in this deck because if you tap out at the end of their turn to play a Deluge, then they can flash in Wandering Emperor and maybe exile it. So maybe it won't work out as well as I think it might, but it might be better suited for a blue midrange deck, an Espera deck, or blue-black midrange. All right, as far as gameplay goes, the main goal is to make your land drops and take over the game with Memory Deluge and Wandering Emperor. 27 lands in this deck. As far as land counts go, usually, if you're aggressive deck, you're going to have 22, 23 decks or lands. In a mid-range deck, maybe closer to 25, 26, and then in control, 27, 28. The idea is, what point of the curve do you want to hit? Typically, for aggro decks, you want to have at least 2 lands on turn 2, probably 3 lands on turn 3, and then after that, it's usually not a big deal if you miss your first land drop. For a mid-range deck, you usually want to guarantee get to 4 or 5 on turn 4 or 5. Maybe depending on the build, if you get stuck on 3 lands, it's not the end of the world. You can still play most of your cards. And a control deck usually wants to hit, at least land 5 on turn 5. In this case, I feel like if you get to 4, you're kind of good. You get to cast a Deluge or a Wandering Emperor. And I think 27 lands good amount for that. You have 4 Deduce. If I didn't have a card like Deduce to cantrip in the early game, I would maybe play 28 lands. Maybe play an extra Surveil land or 2 to help there as well. But I feel like 27 lands was for the deuces the sweet spot to hit your land drops, but also not flood too badly in too many games. But yeah, keeping in mind that you do want to make your land drops until pretty much infinity with 4 Memory Deluge in your deck. So if you feel like you're doing well and have the cards you need, don't hesitate to take that land on your first Memory Deluge. Get to 7 and you'll draw spells. Every situation is different, but as a rule of thumb, I like trying to make a land drop every turn of the game in most matchups, even some of the aggressive matchups. All right, this is a cool win rate matrix courtesy of MTG decks on Twitter from some recent tournaments. I don't think it includes Naples, but you see Azorius Control. It has a decent sample size, 766 matches. 55% win rate, really high for one of the most played decks, only topped by 5-color Legends, also another strong deck. And you see the deck's pretty solid across the board, good against Espera Midrange, 64%, good against Convoke, 53%. I would expect that number to be higher. I think I would rather play against Boros Convoke all day than Espera Midrange, personally. So, take these numbers with a grain of salt, or take what I say with a grain of salt. But yes, the main Ram, just amazing matchup. Really hard to lose game 1 as long as you're making land drops and finding delusion sweepers. It's just really trivial to deal with all their win cons. The Teamer, what they call World Star Ram, Teamer Ramp, Nissa Ramp matchup is close. I feel like that's about accurate. Game 1, you're behind and it's pretty tough. After sideboard, I think you're slightly ahead, but not always enough to make up for the tough game 1. So I like that. I think that number is about accurate. 45% against Golgari midrange. I think that's fair. I think it's a tough matchup, but I would say it's probably closer to 50-50. 5-color Legends, I have struggled. It was one of my losses in Naples. I did go 1-1. So I think 34% is maybe a little low, but it is definitely a tough matchup and a matchup I'd rather not face. And then Ban Toxic, once again, 40%. It's supposed to be a bad matchup. I've had an okay experience with it, but maybe I've just ran good. I've only played the matchup a few times, so I could have just been running good in the small sample size. Gonna go over these most played matchups and go over my quick approach of the matchups and how it's sideboard. So against Espera midrange, game 1 should be okay-ish. They don't have a ton of counters. Maybe they'll draw 1 or 2, but you should be able to navigate if they don't have a perfect draw. Just, in some ways, blue-white control is not that hard to play because a lot of the time you only have one spell you can cast and you should probably cast it, whether it's, use your counters when you can, use your removal when you can, maybe try and play around their counters if they're keeping mana up. And no great tips against midrange, honestly, or just in general. It's hard to describe. Every situation's different, but just try and slow them down. And once you start casting Memory Deluge, you should be good. You'll overpower most decks with that card. As something a little more concrete as far as sideboarding goes, well, I used to bring in extra Tidebinders, but now they're all in the main, so out of these cards, I would bring in the Negate if they have Winning Announcement in their deck. If not, it's probably not worth it. I would bring in the Chrome Host Seed Shark, which lines up pretty well in my experience. Even though they will keep some removal, I think it's okay to bring it in. I think the Dust Animus can be good too if they try to play 2 passes of a game. It's nice to have something you can plot it early in the game and then kind of have something to do on turn 5 without having to tap out. You can keep some mana up. You can also maybe just play it on turn 2 if you feel you need a blocker. I would bring in the Sphinx if I have it in my sideboard. I think it might line up okay against them. And I would probably bring in the March. So let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-ish cards, 4 or 5. And I would actually trim Wandering Emperor because it's expensive and it lines up really poorly against Tidebinder. So I think you can get punished. You want to lower the curve against them. And I like cutting Tidebinder. You could cut, let's say, 1 or 2 Wandering Emperor, maybe go down to 1 Lockdown, or are you bringing in cheap cards? No, you could like, yeah, maybe go down to 1 Lockdown, trim 1 or 2 Wandering Emperors, maybe trim the Get Lost, because you're bringing in a March and giving them the maps is kind of rough. They have a lot of good interaction. You let them draw into more of that, into more lands, have them make their land drops. So I would go something like -2 Wandering Emperor, -1 Lockdown, -1 Get Lost, and -1 Free Steps Ahead. If you're on the play, you can maybe do something like cutting all the lockdowns, and then you can have an extra expensive cards like Free Steps Ahead. Well, I say expensive card, but you can maybe keep all the Free Steps Ahead on the play. Maybe keep a third Wandering Emperor on the play. Things like that, like minor adjustments depending on play draw. But yeah, it's going to be a tough matchup, especially if you're playing against a good player, obviously. But yeah, in my experience, close-ish. Not quite the slam dunk that's 64% is, but it's definitely manageable. Next, you have Boros Convoke. Fairly straightforward. Obviously, if you know you're up against Boros Convoke, mulligan somewhat aggressively. Don't keep too slow of hands. Lockdown is amazing against them, especially game 1. Even though some lists might have 1 Get Lost is somewhat stuck, I feel. So beware of that. But yeah, Lockdown's amazing. Tidebinder is great. Most of your cards are pretty solid against them. And as far as sideboard goes, I would bring in the 2 Lockdowns. I would definitely bring in 2 Lockdowns, Elesh Norn, Dust Animus, that's 4. I would bring in Valkyrie, that's 5, and March is 6. And some people like negate for cards like Forge and Invasion of Gobakon, and the Sea Shark is also decent. It's nice to have a cheap blocker in case you have that invasion. Maybe you can, obviously the turn they take up to cast invasion, meaning they're not adding to the board, means that your blocker might be more relevant. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 8. And what I do is I cut the Farewell because it's expensive, even though it deals with Forge and the Crusade too, which can be nice, the Anthem. So you could keep it in, but for the use can go because you don't have as much time for it, and you have the non-bows lockdown getting your clue, so you don't always get full value. I think the Get Lost can go. It doesn't deal with Forge, and you have the Force March. You have other decent cards. I like keeping in most of the counters, and the Tidebinders are still great. So if you want to bring in all 8 cards, I would cut a Farewell, a Deluge, that's 2. I would cut the Get Lost 3, all 4 disuses, that's 7. And maybe a 3 steps ahead is 8, but I don't think you need negate on the play. And, even Forge out of their deck is, I feel like it's scary, but not too scary. You do have 4 Tidebinders, you do have the Force March, so it's all slow to get going. Also, if you get one of your creatures in play, your, Elesh Norn or Valkyrian stuff, it totally blanks the Forge, so, yeah. I would, if you want to keep it simple, just bring in the 2 lockdowns, Elesh, Dust, Valkyrian March, that's 6 for Farewell, the Deluge, and for Deduce, 6 for 6, more or less. You can maybe keep in the Get Lost. It's fine. Get Lost does get better when you have 4 lockdowns, it's less likely to get used the map, so yeah, I really like this matchup, and I would be happy to play against it all day, even though they can have some crazy good draws, of course. And even that you have March to counter their not draw of Gleeful, Demolition, turn 2, etc. So that's nice. Next, let's talk about the mirror match. No hard rule there, just try to use your card efficiently as always. Try to get value where you can. Try to use the spree mode of 3 steps ahead if you can, or don't be scared to not tap out, as especially if you're making your land drops. It, you try not to run into their counters if you don't have to, and try and gain an advantage where you can. Some people will have Jace. That card can be a win con in the late game. Some games, one of the players just able to snowball with Wandering Emperor. Getting a Wandering Emperor into play when someone taps out for a Deluge can be a really strong play. Yeah, no, it's kind of hard to talk about how to play every matchup, and I'm trying to keep the video somewhat short, so yeah. I'll go over to sideboard, which is somewhat straightforward. You have the sweepers that are pretty bad, the 5 sweepers that are bad. The rest of the cards are pretty reasonable. So let's say cut farewell, Sunfall Lockdown. You bring in a negate, a siege shark, that's 2. You bring in the Sphinx. You bring in Sea Double for their horror, and you bring in your own horror, that's 5. 5 for 5 sweepers. I don't think you need the Force March. I don't think card like Dust Animus is especially good because it's sweet to Wandering Emperor, but I know some people bring it in. And then if somehow you have more cards you want to board out, I think the Flanker are acceptable. A common play in this matchup is to just flash in Tidebinder on the play. If I'm on the play and I say go on turn 3, they say go back, I will almost always just flash in Tidebinder just to start pressuring them, put them in a tight spot. They usually can't counter it because you can just untap and play a Wandering Emperor and put them in a really bad spot. So yeah, being on the play can be pretty big, and the flanker does a good Tidebinder effect in that case. So I could see having some flanker in, but I'm not too sure what I would cut at this point. Going ramp next, I've talked about it. Just make your land drops, make sure you keep finding lands, more deluge, and always have sweepers ready for their creature. Try to take as little damage as possible from a stomper or their creatures in general, or else they might be able to finish you with uncounterable archangels. Use No More Lies on pretty much any spell you can, because a lot of their spells are going to be uncounterable in the late game, or they're going to be able to pay for them. Yeah, having 4 Tidebinders should be nice too to slow them down and make sure you don't die to the recruiter as well. I've just had a really easy time in this matchup. I'm not even sure I've ever lost it. Maybe once in like over 10 matches or something. So yeah, good matchup. And there you can bring in negate. That's 1. Elish Norn 2. Sea Double 3. And that's about it. I don't like horror against people who have Leyline Binding in their deck. I don't want to play, their creatures are a bit better than yours, so I don't want to bring in too many creatures. And you don't really need spot removal, so yeah, fairly minimal sideboarding there. And I would board out the 2 lockdowns as well as maybe trim a Wandering Emperor and then trim a spot removal. One of the marches maybe. But yeah, game 2 they're gonna have access to maybe negate, sometimes duress, sometimes have cards like the Stone Brain. Some players might have Tyrannix Rex. So I like keeping Sunfalls just they're fine in general and you might need them. So yeah, I guess beware of the huge, I think it's 8 mana Dinosaur Haste Toxic Ward 4. They might be able to get used to that. Against Teamer Ramp, tough matchup game 1. Tidebiter should help a bit. Shigeki is annoying in the late game, but I guess your plan game 1 is to try and snowball with Tidebinders and Wandering Emperor and kind of end the game fast. If the game goes a little longer, Farewell can maybe reset their board in their graveyard and help you out. But yeah, DM 1 is going to be an uphill battle. After sideboard, you have access to the negate is decent against them. Couple flankers to exile the graveyard, that's free. Elish Norn just subs almost their entire deck. It's your best sideboard card against them, that's 4. And I'd probably bring in Sea Double 5 as well as Horror 6 and maybe another March 7. And I would board out the 5 sweepers as well as maybe get lost. since you have maybe the Force March is a bit better than Get Lost, and you see that's already too many cards to bring in. I think trimming Wandering Emperor is fine as well. I think on turn 4, I'd usually rather cast a Deluge than a Wandering Emperor. So yeah, if you know they have a lot of cards like Thrun, you know, I like leaving in the Farewell. Maybe you can even keep in a Sunfall, but I'm not too sure. Soul is dependent, but roughly like board out the sweepers except for the Farewell, trim on Wandering Emperor, cut the Get Lost, and yeah, bring in Flankers, Elesh Norn, Sea Devil Horror. I've been winning a lot of games with Hullbreaker Horror. They try to play that slower game or not slower game, but their deck's kind of slow. You're good at slowing them down, and Horror lets you like take over and kill them really fast. So that card's been really nice in that matchup. All right, 3 left and 3 pretty tough matchups. First up, Black-Green Midrange. The game 1 should be decent against you, even though the versions have been getting more and more hateful. They still have a decent amount of deadish cards, deadish removal cards. So game 1 should be okay, and after Sideboard, things get pretty tough, and not too many adjustments there. Really just bring in Bailoff, and that's kind of about it, honestly. I used to have the Tidebinder in the sideboard, and the Jace is actually kind of nice in this matchup. It lines up well against Dread Knight and Glissa. So this list doesn't have Jace. But what I used to do was my old version is I would board out the 2 lockdowns, I would board out the Farewell, and I would bring in 2 Tidebinders and a Bailoff. With this version, I guess Farewell is like acceptable against them, so you can keep that in. You can cut the 2 lockdowns, and bring in Bailoff and maybe March. You could bring in the Seed Shark, I guess, or a Negate is also fine. But yeah, even though Lockdown has targets and it gets rid of Bronco, I'd rather deal with Bronco with Tidebinder, Wandering Emperor, or March. Having to tap out for Lockdown is kind of rough because it can then punish you with Hostile Investigator or a card like that. So yeah, that's how it approached the matchup, just not too much sideboarding. All right, 5-color Legends deck, 4-color, 5-color Legends. This matchup is kind of same as always. Just try to use your cards when you can. Try to use Tidebinder on the Slowgurk, kind of stop Slowgurk from snowballing. It's a tough matchup because their 2-drops are threatening, and you don't always have a removal for them, whether it's Rona or Inti, and their deck's just fairly obnoxious. Keep in mind they usually only have 1 basic swamp, so sometimes Field Overrun can get them, but even that is kind of tricky because they have a lot of lands in their deck, and then as soon as they trigger 1 Slowgurk, it's kind of all undone. So that's not super realistic. Just yeah, do your best to use your Tidebinders and try and pressure them. Sunfall's really good against them. Farewell's really good against them, especially in game 1 when they don't have too many counters and they don't have cards like Lily or their own Chase or Duress. As far as sideboard needing goes, I'm gonna be honest, I'm not sure. I think the Flankers could be okay. I think maybe Stoit Sphinx could be okay, and a Force March would be nice, but I don't know what to board out. The lockdown are always a little awkward because you kind of have to deal with their 2-drops. You have to tap out early, but then that means they might get to tap out for something good. There's nothing I really want to board out that like stands out as an easy board out card, and at the same time I'm not sure how good the flankers are. Resetting their graveyard is kind of nice. It can also sometimes trade with an NT in the early game, but yeah, maybe that's a matchup where maybe having Hearse would be nice because it's good against their graveyard early. It is, it is a threat to potentially attack a Planeswalker or even block, and you have all these Tidebinders and Wandering Emperor token to turn it on. If you have Hearse and Rest in Peace in your sideboard, I would maybe just board out the lockdowns, just because of the awkwardness of Hearse plus lockdown. I think lockdown is like good enough to maybe keep 1 or 2 copies in if you don't have Hearse and Rest in Peace, but once you get that awkwardness, maybe just board out all the lockdowns and hope for the best. But yeah, tough matchup. Just try and stop them as best you can, and no real tip here. I don't think it's horrendous, and they're not the most consistent. They do get awkward draws, and Tidebinder is extremely good against them. You can also maybe start copying Tidebinders with 3 steps ahead, and kind of finish the game fast as Wandering Emperor. But yeah, tough matchup. Last but not least, Bant Toxic, which I think the Tidebinders is kind of your best card. It lets you play a flash game. It's a blocker. It stops a lot of trigger, and having 4 in the main is definitely going to help there. I wish there was more of that kind of card you could play in your sideboard, but yeah, keep in mind they have counters and even more after sideboard. So one game I played in Naples, and I think that's a somewhat common pattern against that deck, is that once you get to freelance, they're going to try to keep mana up for a counter because of your lockdowns. I played a game where my opponent went turn 1, the green 1/2 into Skrell's Hive, and I had lockdown on turn 3, but she had mana up, and I was lucky enough to have some Tidebinders, so I just decided to deploy my Tidebinders first, even just countering a Hive trigger or Myrex trigger. I played a couple Tidebinder, and then I got to 5 mana, and I played my lockdown with 2 mana up. I had no more lies. I could pay for Spell Pierce. Sometimes if you don't have the free poisons yet, you can also pay for their 2 mana counter. That's only 2 more if you don't have if you're not infected. So yeah, keep in mind that, or try to play around their counters if you can afford to. Obviously, some games you just have to slam the lockdown and pray it's good enough. But yeah, just try to jockey or try to play around their spells a bit. For people who have played against infected moderns, a bit of the same thing. A lot of time you'll let them take you'll take the damage to not run into the pump spells and play removal spells end of turn. This is not exactly the same, but there's a bit of that, just maneuvering over their cards. And keep in mind they can kind of kill you out of nowhere. Was the green 1/2 and the blue march if they have a bunch of creatures out. So even when it looks like you might be safe, keep in mind they can get you for a lot of poison counters out of nowhere with these 2 cards. As far as sideboard goes, I think you want for sure the 2 lockdowns, the Shark because it's a cheap blocker. I think the Sphinx would be quite good in this matchup, and I would bring in Dust Animus, that's 5. You might want March, you might want Negate, and maybe some Flankers even. I would actually board out most of my sweepers just because they're expensive. Their deck just kills really fast, so you want as low as a curve as possible, so you can cut Sunfall and Farewell, you can maybe trim a Memory Deluge, you can trim on Get Lost, so that would be like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, up to 8. Yeah, just keep your curve low, and it's possible you just want flankers as a way to block, scry, make sure you make your land drops. Obviously, the 1 toughness is really bad against their deck, so maybe that's all too bad. And same, I'm not convinced March is. You probably want all your cheap cards, but yeah, the cheap creatures are good, extra lockdown, and then trim mostly on Deduce, maybe trim 1 Deluge. I could see maybe keeping the Farewell, even though it's expensive, but at least it gets rid of the Hive. But yeah, as I said, your best card in the matchup are Lockdown, Tidebinder. Wandering Emperor is really strong against them, though. It takes over real fast. So tough matchup, but I think it's kind of manageable. All right, well, that was it. I'm not sure how long this video is. Hopefully I kept it somewhat under 20 minutes. Hopefully it was interesting. And yeah, as always, if you're still watching, thank you so much. Make sure you give a like, subscribe if you like the content, keeps me going, leave a comment. And I'll have a bunch of links down below with links to deck lists, my Twitch stream, all that good stuff. Yeah, thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll see you next time. Take care.